Thanks for coming. This is really exciting. It's totally relevant with the survey because I know exactly 11 UX researchers in Vancouver. So every single one of them filled out that survey, which is wonderful. And it is kind of incredible that there's so many people who want to come and listen to me talk about talking. For the most part, our conversation is going to be from the perspective of a UX researcher because that's where all my professional experience is. But that's not to say that these lessons and recommendations and tips and fallacies can't be applied to normal conversations that you have with friends or your colleagues at work or in the home. It's just talking. And I've been really quite lucky to be paid to talk to strangers for the last 10 years. It's ridiculous. And my boss is here tonight, which is even funnier because you pay me just to talk to people. It's incredible. I'm super lucky. So are 10 other people. And over time, I've learned a ton of lessons, and I want to share those with you. But I also want to say that some of these things won't work for you the way they work for me because we're all different people. And yeah, so it's important, and I also really like this UX meetup group to get to know one another because UX researchers are hard to come by, that we can learn a lot from each other, and that's why I really go out of my way to help take notes or just observe sessions moderated by other researchers, be them brand new or like 10,000 hours level, because you can learn something always. You just have to be a little bit open to it. We're going to cover some super important material. I stole this from the internet. I thought it was just a good intro into interviewing in general. But it's not that important. We'll share the deck so you can read this later. And before we talk about like helpful tips, I'll just give you a little bit more background about me. To give you an idea, this is the greatest moment of my life when I met my favorite pair of animals. They're tapirs. There was 2 of them. You can't see my brain spilling out of my ears, but it was like the greatest. This is my wife howling at nothing in particular with a dog that is not ours. This is our cat, Momo. I work from home, so she sleeps for 24 hours a day from my desk, so she's basically my like one-on-one colleague. And this is a small sample of adoptable dogs that my wife has sent me in the last 2 weeks. So, like a small sample. So I have a pretty high-level understanding of what your roles are, but when it comes to actually conducting interviews, just show of hands, who has never conducted an interview before? Great. How about 10 interviews? Who's done upwards of 100? Show of hands. All right, all right. The number's climbing, raise your hands. It's a race.
I don't know, I can't count that high.
Somebody should be raising their hand right now. This is really good actually because in my notes I said if anyone still has their hands up, just pass the mic. They're way more qualified than I am to be talking about any of this. Let's talk about the feels. When you're interviewing someone you've never met before. We're talking to strangers here. It's kind of scary. You might be excited. You might feel nervous, which it's important to feel all of those things, like to be honest, I'm pretty nervous right now, and this is generally the way I feel every time I go into a new study. Say I have 20 interviews to do, that first one, there's a lot of pressure. New to the material, new to the users, generally new to the client. I don't know how everything's gonna run. It's uncharted territory. But it's a really good reason to always run a pilot. Just like a dress rehearsal. And the best part of running a pilot is that it takes zero effort. Like, there is nothing easier than running a pilot, because it's no different than just doing a normal interview. It's more of this mental shift towards trying to focus on all these insights you're trying to gather and collect and be a good researcher. And it gives you this opportunity to focus and basically research your research. And you'll be able to see what questions garner really thoughtful feedback and other questions that you thought were going to be amazing that participants can't understand for the life of them. And for me, the biggest reason I run a pilot study is that it gives me a little bit more confidence going into the rest of those 19 interviews. And it's so simple, because if you have enough time, you can run a pilot with your colleague before the study even starts. And you can go into that first real paid interview feeling like a superhero. Or you can take my lead, which is not always the best to follow, and not have time, and treat that first paid interview that is costing the client lots of money as a learning lesson for yourself. And realistically, this presentation is just a pilot. I've never done this presentation before, and hopefully I can get some critical feedback later. And I promise that if I ever present this again, it's gonna be better. Sorry. But what if you still feel like Kermit after you run a pilot? You just need to keep talking to strangers. I know this is pretty deep stuff that I'm covering. This smart guy would say you should probably talk to or conduct 10,000 hours worth of interviews to master the skill set. Just like he talked about these violinists mastering their craft in his book Outliers, which is a great book. Thankfully, he's been proven wrong. And I still want to stay on this music narrative because I love this idea of like mastering your craft and whatnot. Also because jazz musicians are so cool. But it's this idea as we move from total noobs in our craft to experienced professional interviewers, there's a point where we spend less time looking at the words in our moderator guides, those things, those scripts that we have to tell us exactly what to say, and more time building a conversation that we actually have less control of. Much in the same way, these rad jazz musicians have a set of chord changes or a guide, if you will, and then they just blow your heads off with some really cool stuff. As professional masters of the craft, you make yourself a little bit more vulnerable to your participant. And you focus less on what you wrote down on that sheet and the interactions you have with these strangers. There is a but, because I've gone too far ahead. And we need to take a few steps back, because before you can run a pilot study or run anything, become a jazz musician, you need to do a lot of work. And there's another amazing insight here. which I'm sure you guys, like this is good stuff. I will share this deck with you. Questions have to be answered, like who are we going to talk to? How many of these people should we actually talk to? How are we going to find these people to talk to in the first place? How much should we pay them? Should we pay them? Are they going to be in person, face-to-face, or remote? What technology do we need for these sessions? Are we going to be evaluating something like doing a usability study, or is this going to be pretty like pie in the sky, foundational, open-minded, generative conversation? Will I have to take my own notes? Which is the worst question. And there's so many things to do before you can even focus on these moderating techniques, but they're not moderating techniques, so we won't talk about them. What we should talk about is this part, because I would assume based on the name of this presentation, that's why you're here. That is not the end of my presentation. But I almost started clapping. Okay. This is going great. Yeah, so this is so important. Again, it sounds simple, but just because it's simple doesn't mean it's easy. Likely you're paying these people to talk to. And they are kind of taking time out of their day to help you. And it's important that the first message that I try to communicate to the people I'm talking with is that I appreciate them. Fortunately, humans also like to feel like they're contributing to the community. And it's kind of nice because in our society, all that has to do is this little signal, it's thank you. And just like that, you have started building a relationship that will likely live for 60 minutes, and then it'll be over, and you will never see that person again, maybe, unless you bump into them on the street, and that can be pretty weird later. And it is kind of funny because these participants who we talk to, and we call them research respondents, or users, or sample, but they're just humans, and they are the most important people in our careers as UX researchers. Without them, we would be destined to become data scientists. And, oh God, I can't think of a more grim future than data science. Data science. All right, I'm envious. I'm not smart enough to be a data scientist. They make more money than us. So I'm gonna cut them down. All right, so you said thank you. These participants know you appreciate them. And you've likely sat them down in this room that probably feels too sterile, or it's at the client's office and it's totally cluttered and there's weird stuff on the walls that makes no sense and they're confused and feeling uncomfortable already. Or if it's a remote interview, at this point you've managed to connect through the video conferencing software, which likely means you're 15 minutes into your interview, because here's a very important UX research only secret. You can do 10,000 hours worth of interviews. You could do 100,000 hours worth of interviews, and technology will find a way to fail you over and over again, which, oh man, this is me. Fortunately, most of us humans can connect on that stereotype. Technology is a massive part of our lives, but it fails all of us. It's agnostic to who you are. And we can use this stereotype to our advantage. Personally, the person I'm having a remote interview with, or even an in-person interview with, has probably already heard me badmouth the technology, like be it the computer or the internet connection or the video conferencing software or the prototype. And like again, technology, it's a huge part of our work, and the list goes on and on, but complaining, which may not be the greatest thing to do, but it's happening at the beginning of our interviews. And it's a pretty common theme in my interviews because I am seriously awful with technology. And secretly what this does is it communicates to the person I'm talking with that I'm just a normal human that doesn't like when the internet's slow. And it helps build our parameters around what this conversation can be. Because if I'm complaining, then it's okay for them to complain. It's not a normal conversation. These people aren't your friends. You're not talking about, I don't have many friends, so I don't know what friends talk about. My wife just tells me what to do, and I do. So for a lot of people, they are uncomfortable. They're feeling like Kermit, and you're feeling like Kermit, and it's weird. So it's our job to make them feel less awful. And one part of this is the fact that they are getting paid to be here and talk to us, so they want to please us. They don't want to say the wrong thing or fail, because in their minds, maybe they'll jeopardize that massive incentive payment that they're going to receive at the end of the interview. And it's our job to make it crystal clear that they can really do nothing wrong. Because even if they fail every single usability task you give them, that's a success. Like, that's why you're having that conversation in the first place. Now, another part of that is if they are having a problem and they're feeling really weird, they might be just lying to you and giving you bad data, so it becomes really, really important to foster this rapport with them and just make sure that they feel comfortable. Important note here, I am not recommending that you start every interview bitching about like your Wi-Fi, because that's my thing, and then it'll just like catch on and it'll stop working. Just be a normal human, which I won't make a developer joke here. But like, just have feelings and be open and be vulnerable. These are other humans. You're just having a conversation with them. You're not in a lab, even though we call them labs. It's a conversation. It also helps to have a good sense of humor. And if that's a huge obstacle, there is definitely that data science path still open. No data scientists in the room? Great. Yeah, so people like to please us. I said that already. It's actually part of our job to help them fail. This is a really important fact. And a lot of the time, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for, failure. Especially with the usability study, I need to know what doesn't work. Like, it's great to hear what is working and like, oh, they think the logo is super chic, but if it doesn't work, I'm not doing my job. If they're struggling, I'll often give people a little bit of support, like a verbal treat, like, oh, this is really interesting. Oh, you're doing great. And I just like such a really small input to help them know that they're not doing anything wrong. They could be failing, but that doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong. Because the concept of right and wrong doesn't have the same meaning for a research participant. Just think about that for a minute. Again, you're trying to get at their true behavior. They are potentially trying to mask their true behavior. And if that behavior is failing, help them show you that. But you do not want to waste all of your time helping people fail, because it's important to actually get them on track at some point. And it is also incredibly important to be sincere. And I've only been called out on this once, but participants usually know when they're screwing up and they're not passing the task. Like, the error message is right there every time. They can't move on past the loading screen. It's like your account is not happening. And if you give them some encouragement, like, oh, you're doing great, they're not. You're lying to them. They are failing. They know they're failing. This whole thing sucks. That's likely a good opportunity to just talk through the process that got them into this situation in the first place. So these rules are riddled with caveats that you don't see on the screen, so I can't be disproved. But something research respondents love to do, because they're so unsure of their actions and they want your approval before they do the wrong thing and fail, it's a good opportunity to deflect their questions, because the best answer to our participant's question is a thoughtful question from the moderator. That way you can help continue on this train of thought and not bias their movements as to, should I click that green continue button? Well, if I say yes, that's pretty obvious. If I say no, also pretty obvious. So you try to throw the ball back in their court and see what happens. Because in the real world, we're not there to hold their hand or answer their questions. They're on their own. And if it turns out that they have no idea what to do, or they can't make it through a failure without totally dropping off, incredibly important insight to know. Yeah, participants always want to know if they're about to fail, or if they're about to do the right thing. Either way, at the right moment, you can always deflect with another question. Especially if you're testing something new, like a prototype that's not totally finished. Even if it is finished, as soon as I use the word prototype, in my mind, it's not. Designers love working with me. And so if you're running into a failure, the person might know they're failing. They might ask you if they're failing. But it's not finished yet, so we don't know. It might not work that way at the end, and that's why we're having the conversation in the first place. Slightly more difficult when you're on a fully dev website and the errors are out of your control. And then, sometimes it makes absolutely no sense to deflect questions, because people aren't super happy when you answer a question with another question. So if the train of thought isn't really that important, or you really have more valuable material to cover, just pivot and move on. I mean, you really only have so much time to cover so many questions. You really need to be efficient. And if you have a talkative person on your hands, they will talk your ear off, and most often, totally off topic. They might dabble into some material that you're interested in, likely not, and they can go on forever. And this is the biggest issue I have with facilitating interviews, because I hate conflict. I do not want to interrupt them. Even if they're wasting my time, I still this deep-seated Canadian small feelings. It's awful. But I know if I don't stop the train wreck and get back on track, I won't have data that I need to write a report, and then my clients are going to be really upset, and I don't like conflict, so I don't like when my clients are upset. So I face my fears. I tell them to shut their mouths. I don't do that ever. Oh God, that just makes me nervous. Here's a tip for interrupting someone that I have spent 10 years crafting because it is so weird for me. Just say their name, because that will catch them off guard and potentially they'll take a breath. I like to follow that up with a very heavy-handed apology, and then you can refocus on material and make it sound like we're running out of time. I actually have love your feedback on something else. Let's go over here. Thanks for talking about this thing that I've never seen before. And we can bring them around. Another point on being efficient is if the person you're talking to is unqualified to be talking to you in the first place. And maybe they lied on their screening survey, maybe they were honest, but your screening survey sucked. It's a huge waste of your time if you're getting little to no valuable feedback. And it's something that comes with experience, because less experienced moderators might continue to drag out this interview for the entire duration and find anything that they could suck out of them. But I am well past that, and I don't like wasting time, so I kill the interview. If you're 10 minutes in of a 60-minute interview, there's no one's gonna fire you, maybe. All right, I'll just stop talking about that line of thought. Clients aren't usually upset with me when I don't waste their time either, because they might be on the line. And we've got some guy on the call who will not shut up about his sweet truck that he bought a year ago. And so you can just thank them for their time, be honest, tell them that you've gathered everything you needed. If you've recruited them, you still have to pay them, so they're not gonna be upset by any means. If you've recruited them through a professional recruiter, however, you might not have to pay them, which, here's a little tip. Make sure to have that conversation with your recruiters before you start the study. How do you deal with participants who are unqualified to participate during the interview? Some of them will, some great recruiters will probably blacklist that person from participating in any of their future studies, and talk to all their recruiter friends and tell them about Jake being a jerk. If they're not such a great recruiter, they might not do anything for you, and you'll still have to hand over $100 for a useless interview. And finally, my last point on being efficient is something that happens to interviewers of all experience levels. It's not just new people to the industry, because I saw this the other day from someone who should know better, but it's cramming way too many questions in your moderator guide. And it comes from clients breathing down your neck, asking for all kinds of things that may or may not be important to them. And then you've got your designers who want to know what's actually going to help them, and you're trying to balance this, and your idea of balance is just doing everything because you hate conflict and your life is a nightmare. All right, I was looking at one of my own mod guides, and it was incredible. There was no way I was going to make it through this material, and it's so important to do that pilot I was talking about earlier, because then you realize, oh, I can only get through a third of the questions that I have available. But as you grow in experience, you can look at questions and create assumptions of how much feedback is going to be garnered per question, and then you can track time and have a pretty good idea of how many questions you can actually get through. And it's a general assumption, because sometimes a participant will get through an hour's worth of questions in 30 minutes, and other times you won't get through half the questions. But we don't have to be perfect, because we're not data scientists. One of the biggest problems with cramming so many questions into your moderator guide is that you don't have an opportunity to ask more questions and dig deeper. If you have more questions than time to ask those questions, there's no room for you to explore any critical thinking beyond your moderator guide. And let me tell you this, that's not great, because after doing this for 10 years, I can think of a pretty heavy list of excellent questions. But complete strangers who have no background in technology, who might be reviewing a website with me or talking about how they bought new siding for their house, they develop new trains of thought that were totally foreign to my thinking before I even put this plan in action. And then it just builds, and you realize that moderator guide is just that. It's not the rules. Feel free to get off. And I'm not recommending you ask every participant why 5 times to get at the root cause of something that they did or said, because that's an interrogation technique and it's very uncomfortable. And we've talked about conflict, and that's not happening. It's also a really important thing to focus on what your participants are saying. Because if you want to dig deeper, you need material to work with to actually go deeper. If your participant says one thing and they're focused on this one element, and then you want to go deeper in another direction, you are breaking the conversation, and it feels choppy and weird, and it's a really typical behavior that less experienced moderators exhibit, because we have this guide, and even though you're off here beyond my guide talking about really important stuff, I'm focused on answering these questions that the client approved. But it is also, it's important to scrape a little bit and dig deep, but maybe not 5 whys deep. For example, you may be testing the Prada website, because who wouldn't want to work for Prada? And your participants land on a page like this, and likely, if I was being interviewed, I would say something along the lines of, "This is awful, potentially gross, because I'm not very fashionable." And if everyone we talked to said something like that, and we left it at that, the finding would be pretty shallow, and it's not an insight at all. And I can't tell you how many times I look at reports and they're full of information just like this, but information is rarely actionable, and it stems from not asking enough questions and digging deeper. So likely you'd have to go a little bit deeper and talk about different elements on the page and break those down, or maybe it has nothing to do with the page at all. But you can't stop asking until you confidently feel like that thought is complete, especially if it is an incredibly important topic that you're covering. As you move through these interviews with your participants, you are building a relationship right from the thank you at the get-go, and likely you're also gaining their trust, which you have the opportunity to leverage that trust once it's built, and that's likely at the later part of your interview. And not so much at the beginning when participants feel like Kermit and things are still kind of awkward and they're trying to figure out if you're a decent human or a robot. And so the easy solution is save the tough questions for the end. Once you've built this real relationship, you've built the trust, take advantage of it. That's the only reason we get paid to do what we do. And when it comes to the questions that you ask, you need to watch your language, but not in like the traditional sense. Granted, you probably shouldn't swear in an interview, but honestly, nothing puts a smile on my face listening to a participant just like swear their head off in some awful like vocal diatribe about a button that's in the wrong place or the wrong color while the client is observing in the back room. It's wonderful. That's a dream. But there's so many rules when it comes to asking questions. I'll give you a few of them. Guaranteed, no surprises here. For an idea, when you're usability testing, it's easy to use words in your questions that can be found on the screens that you're testing. And I promise you, if you ask someone what they would do next, and there is a blue button in the bottom right-hand corner that says next on it, you can read their minds. It's incredible, because you're just serving up answers unconsciously. You didn't think about it. And sometimes it happens by accident, and it's painful, but immediately, because you're a good UX researcher, you're like, oh, I screwed that up, change my mod guide for the rest of the interviews, and move on. Be flexible, be open, you can pivot. Another question faux pas that crushes my UX soul is asking more than one question at a time. Primarily because I listened to a project manager do this in an internal meeting this morning where the question came up. It was a good question, well communicated, and then everyone was like scrambling to turn off mute, and so it was silent. So there was a follow-up question that was related to the first question, and there was some like choppy bits trying to answer the first question, and so she followed up with another question, and another question, and by the end of it, it was totally useless, and it's something that I am accountable for on numerous occasions because it's easy to ask more than one question at one time. And it's brutally difficult for participants to try to answer one of those questions successfully. You're definitely hurting the credibility of your research at that point. Last one about language relates to jargon. We're in the tech world. A lot of funny terms and phrases flying around the office that unfortunately sometimes lands in the interviews that we conduct. It's definitely a bad idea. It's much easier to just ask yourself, could a child answer this question that I put together? Because children don't know what a pain point is, or what a call to action is, or a workflow. And yet I see those terms in moderator guides, and I feel awful. You also need to watch your face. This is something you will not find on most how to be a great interviewer lists. Seriously, watch interview recordings of yourself or others if you have access to them, and just focus on that interviewer's face. It's more helpful when it's you because you're probably in the moment and you're thinking like, man, I have this great poker face and I'm being neutral and I'm composed, and your eyeballs just fell out of your face, Nyle. Like, what kind of a message am I sending to my participant? The caveat here is you don't want to be a robot either, because I used to work with one, and she was an absolute brilliant UX researcher. She came from academia, and we'd go into interviews together, and I'd be taking notes as a faithful assistant, and she would remain stone cold throughout the entire thing, never responsive to anything anyone would do or say. She had a great poker face. But it made me uncomfortable, and I knew it was happening over and over and over again. So to think of the research participants that were going through that hour of torture with Research Robot, not great. It turns out people are more willing to talk to humans. So the recommendation here is be a human. Just like calm and composed. Another tip around conducting better interviews: stop talking. This is a very, very popular recommendation on every single list of how to be a better moderator. But I don't want to talk about like stop listening and listen to your, or stop talking and start listening to your, we'll save that for the next slide. Stop talking and really listen to your participant. Duh, we know that. I want to talk about the tactical methodology of actually going through this very uncomfortable process. If you're like me and don't deal with conflict very well, to just ask a question and let it go. It's gonna feel awkward, I promise you, but you're the one who created this awkward environment, so it's your responsibility to be cool with that. And that comes from talking to more strangers. Your participant needs time to formulate an answer or just think about the question that you asked them. They might stall because they're confused or they don't know what to do, expecting you're gonna come in and save them, because in normal human conversations, that's the nice, right thing to do. Okay, so maybe you shouldn't be a human in this moment, because you have to let them be on their own. Again, real world, we're not gonna be there. You're really just providing this space for them to give you the answers you need. That's what we're there for. So just give people space. Also, don't crowd participants. They like some personal space too. Not important enough to put on a slide. Also, with the stop talking bit, it's really important for you as a moderator to do this when other situations come up. For example, I have clients observe my sessions in real time, and they're instant messaging me awful questions, and then I'm reading and thinking like, oh my god, this client, seriously? And then I'm off topic, and my participant has gone in another direction, and I ask a question over here, and it's awful. It's everything I told you what you should not be doing, when in fact, you can stop it all at the beginning and just say, sorry, I just need 1 minute. I just need to get back on track. And I promise you, it will be so much more productive for you to take 30 seconds and compose yourself and realize where you even are on the prototype, or what your participant just said, or what question your client wants you to ask, and then come back and be engaged and not be this awful, rambling, hot mess. So it's not just the talking that you should stop, it's also the listening, which you won't find on any list, because people who are qualified enough to do this stuff know it's an awful recommendation that would get torn to pieces. However, when it comes to tracking human behavior, which is what I'm really interested in, I love to see people do things. I don't love to listen to people talk about how they think they might do things, because humans are incredibly unreliable when it comes to that. So if I want to understand how people use Uber, I'm not going to talk about how they might use Uber. I'm just going to sit down with them, open the app, and let them run through it, and just see what they do. After you're giving your participant a task, I always prompt them to think aloud, which is a very traditional thing, which is somewhat foolish because I'm telling you not to listen, because even though I tell them like, speak out loud, my ears are off. All I care about is like watching that mouse and seeing what they're doing and listening to the size. Even though the words are somewhat important and potentially they don't totally contradict what they are actually doing, but it's kind of funny to watch someone do something while they're talking about doing something, and there are no parallels in those two channels. And if you don't have an app like Uber to test, you can look back on past behavior, because it's much harder for someone to lie to you about them maybe buying this tank top. Instead, just go and look at their shopping cart from a month ago when they did. So those are two big ones. I've recommended you to stop talking and stop listening. You guys are going to be great interviewers soon. Awful. These are great. So if I'm not listening to the words, what else am I trying to focus on? Really everything. And there's a lot. This is something I see far too often, which generally gives me the impression my participant is having a really good time with me. Nonverbal communication, again, this is not new stuff, but incredibly important. It's really nice to be in a room with someone to track this kind of information. Much easier than like a 1-inch webcam view of someone's face. But you can pull a lot of like vocal information, like speed, tone, pitch, eye contact, blinking, physical gesture, sign, body position. There's so many things that you can track, which also kind of sucks because you just can't track that. And I recommend you don't even try. I actually recommend that you don't take notes at all during your sessions. Get someone else to. And if there's no one available, you should be recording these sessions, and there's really awesome free transcription services available, so you don't have to go back and watch 20 hours of your awful, not awful, but it's just so painful if you've done 1,000 interviews and you go back and you watch a recording and you're like, oh my God, I sound like that. Sorry. So you can focus on actually having a conversation with this person and not trying to transcribe your conversation with them. Because 10 years ago when I got started, there was no money for an assistant. There was no time for me to go back and watch my recording. So while I'm having a very awful conversation with this person, I'm trying to transcribe at the same time, and things are shallow. And I promise you, my interviews now that don't involve any note-taking from me are much higher quality. If anything, I'll take timestamps just to come back to a recording that I found, okay, that point was really interesting, or I will literally just say, oh, that was interesting. Then I search the transcription later for, oh, that was interesting. I'm like, Nyle, you're so good at your job. So just a quick tip. It's not all about having a bundle of notes at the end of the session. And it's important not to lose sight of the fact that interviews are a team sport. And personally, I encourage everyone from my internal team to observe at least a few sessions just to get a sense of what we're hearing. Because at some point, I'm going to have to present this fat research report, and if I don't have any backup from my team and the client starts poking holes through my research, it's going to be sad. I'm conflicted first. It's It's like I turn into a snail and put mute on. But interviews are boring, and your project managers are not going to be interested in staying focused. They've got Gantt charts to build, so you need to give them responsibilities. Again, there's so much information that these research respondents are giving you that you can't track on your own, so make your observers do it. Focus on facial expressions. Just listen or watch for nonverbal communication. Or, if you're lucky enough, have someone take those transcribed notes for you, because likely they are better than the machine doing it off your recording. And when it comes to the clients, I also like to bring them in. Like I said before, just like your internal team having your back in that research readout, it's also really helpful when your clients were there, or one or two of them sat through a couple interviews and heard for themselves that some of this information isn't made up by Nyle. This is what our customers said. Helps to build the confidence a little bit. But there are rules when it comes to clients, and that is they do not get to speak with participants because they ask the worst questions you could ever imagine every single time. I have zero trust in any client to ask thoughtful, concise, only one question. They do not watch their language at all. It's also the fact that you've just spent an hour building this relationship with a total stranger, and they've got to this point where they're telling you about things that there was no way they were going to tell you 45 minutes ago. And then for a client to come in who's likely doesn't have their webcam on and it's just a really loud, boomy voice, it's not great. So a really easy way to get around this is just have them message you. Or if you're lucky enough to have an assistant, message your assistant, and your assistant will funnel you these nice, beautiful questions which you could ask in real time. Or if you don't get to them, save it for the end, because you likely should spend a few minutes at the end making sure your clients are happy and everything's been answered. I also like to have a little debrief with my clients at the end of a day of interviews, again, just to hear what they heard, because we're all humans and we interpret things differently. And having them on your side at that research readout is so incredibly valuable. We covered a few things. We didn't even scratch the surface when it comes to conducting interviews. But we do have time to answer some questions from you guys. Yes? Time? 5 minutes? 2 minutes? I took too much time? All right, so here is a very brief reminder of all the genius things I almost said to you guys tonight. I'll send you the deck. This is all awful. Well, I'm just kidding. I really believe in almost half of this stuff. So, raise of hands. Who's brave enough to answer or to ask a question that's really thoughtful and only one question? Yes, David?
Yeah, you talked about debriefing at the end of interviews. Do you also do debrief between each interview? Or just all?
It depends how many interviews I'm trying to cram into a day. At one point, I thought it was a great idea to set that number at 8 interviews a day. That was young and dumb, Nyle. 5 interviews is like my ceiling now. And if I have 3 to 5 interviews, I won't debrief in between, because unless they're only there for one session. But I want them to feel included in the analysis part.
What length are those interviews? 5 interviews?
An hour.
Got another easy one though. You mentioned free transcription services. What would you recommend?
Otter.
Otter.
Yeah,
Did we work on that?
we did.
Otter.ai.
There's probably only one vowel in it, right? They've dropped the
There's also Descript, I think, as a free service. I actually pay for transcription, which is $1 a minute, which really adds up.
Yeah.
But clients pay for it, so it doesn't. I don't have to,
Right.
because they do perfect transcriptions, and it's also cheaper for us. It's cheaper for us to pay someone to transcribe an hour, 60 minutes, versus what we actually bill the client out. So I tell the clients it's us saving them money.
What's the name of the product?
I use rev.com for paid transcriptions. It's pretty sketchy. I think like 80% of research tools are.
It's so worth it.
Yeah, it's
I've got a really good interface too.
yeah. But it just comes back perfectly transcribed.
Yeah, the thing with machine learning is it's not perfect, and so sometimes you look at your transcriptions and you're like, this cannot go to the client. There's some really raunchy stuff that no one said. Moving on.
How do you feel about the person who built it also interviewing for others?
Yeah, it's really hard to be objective when you're testing something that you've built. It's far from impossible because tons of UX designers are responsible for testing their designs. So you just have to be cognizant that you have a higher amount of bias towards influencing your participant, and you have to work a little bit harder to really take your ego out of the interview. Thankfully, I'm not allowed to design anything, so I don't have to worry about it, which is for good reason. I have no design background, and that I like to think it gives me an edge, because sometimes I don't know why things are built a certain way, and I never have any personal buy-in to the product.
So regarding the last point, clients don't get to speak. So I see why you should involve the clients, but at the same time, like for someone who's a junior researcher or for someone who's bringing in UX research new to that company or to the clients, they need to like sort of feel that they trust this researcher. So that's why they sometimes get involved in the interviews, or maybe the researcher wants to get them involved so they would gain some sort of like trust. So how would you balance these two things?
Yeah, I've never been able to balance it, because even now when I tell clients like, hey, these are going to be the sessions, you can log in, please mute yourself, I will draw a very clear line in the sand of what you can and cannot do, and that includes not talking to the participant. And sometimes they will. They'll be like, oh, I have a really great question. Off mute. So, what did you think of the blue button on the landing page that you looked at 45 minutes ago? Let me rephrase that. So, it's really difficult. I've worked with in-house researchers, but not to the point of having them participate in my interviews. It's challenging though, if you're a junior and you don't have anyone guiding you above or guiding the client,
Yeah.
it could certainly be challenging.
It is.
Anything else? Come on, we talked a lot of them. Many crazy things were said tonight.
Hi. I'm actually a developer, so...
Sorry, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. Why did you not stop me?
Thank you for not making the joke. So, I worked for companies, and most of them all had like customer care like departments that take calls, and we get feedback from that, and then that helps us like rewrite some of the stuff that we do. But I actually didn't know that like you guys existed until now. But I guess fair enough, because you only know other people.
Yeah, well, what's incredible for me is the last 10 years of a transformation of the industry, because trying to tell a client 10 years ago that you should spend $5,000 to get answers to questions that you think you already know was tough. And now there are 11 UX researchers in Vancouver and enough work for like 1,100.
Yeah, so my question is actually, why would someone go with a researcher instead of like just customer care and then they can also...
Yeah, so that's a great place to start, and that's a side of the client team that we try to tap into because they are full of really important information, especially if it's a usability project. They have a very clear idea of what's not working because people who aren't getting paid are telling them. So it's a great opportunity. However, it does have its limitations, and if you want to understand the why something doesn't work or what's the root cause of that failure, that's where hiring a UX researcher to come and actually do a thorough investigation into this material makes sense.
Do you have any suggestions for how to run a really good pilot interview or pilot usability test before running the real thing?
Yeah, running a great pilot study is about focusing less on getting answers to your questions and focusing on the questions themselves. And it's just this opportunity, like, again, it takes zero effort. You could do it with a colleague the day before or a few hours before your first real participant is coming into your office. And it is purely a dress rehearsal. You run through your script, you see what kind of issues you might have with the technology, issues you might have with the product you're testing. There's really nothing fancy you need to do. It's more just shifting your focus away from trying to glean insight in the material that you're paid to do and really focus on your research. Yeah.
You mentioned the 5 whys being an interrogation technique. I'm wondering if you had some other tips on uncovering root causes.
I think the key to digging deeply in a very safe and friendly manner is being able to bounce whatever your participants are saying back at them, just in a slightly different way or from a different angle that you might be interested in. Obviously, you can't be like, oh, why'd you click on that button? Well, I want to move forward. Well, why do you want to move forward? Well, I want to do this. And that sucks. Like, that's not fun conversation. You can't pay someone enough money to sit in a room with you and be like that. So it's really just the ability to improvise based on the material your participants are giving you. Last question.
Just out of curiosity, have you ever had a bad interview where the participant was either unqualified or the product you were testing was not good? And how did you handle that?
Oh, I have experienced that so many times. That is a great question because it happens. Sometimes our timelines are so tight that the design team is like, nope, the prototype is not ready, and you're here to usability test the prototype. So you try to reschedule and push it. If the participant is totally unqualified, usually I will be mean to them and ask them questions and be like, oh, there's got to be something useful in you. And like I can last a few questions and then I just cut them loose and send them a check and save 45 minutes of my life. Really. Like, don't be afraid to just stop the interview and be honest. Just be like, okay, we've covered all of the material I wanted to, that you're qualified to answer, because everything else, they would be lying to you because they have no real opinion on it.
Thank you.
All right.